said Paul emphatically. He knows I won't associate with him if he doesn't. He is really full of wickedness, I think. And has Nora found out about the Golden Lady yet? No, but I think she suspects. I'm almost sure she watched me the last time I went to the cave. I don't mind if she finds out. It is only for her sake I don't want her to, so that her feelings won't be hurt. But if she is determined to have her feelings hurt, it can't be helped. If I were to go to the shore some night with you, do you think I could see your rock people too? Paul shook his head gravely. No, I don't think you could see my rock people. I'm the only person who can see them. But you could see rock people of your own. You're one of the kind that can. We're both that kind. You know, teacher, he added, squeezing her hand chummily. Isn't it splendid to be that kind, teacher? Splendid, Anne agreed, grey shining eyes looking down into blue shining ones. Anne and Paul both knew how fair the realm imagination opens to the view, and both knew the way to that happy land. There the rose of joy bloomed immortal by dale and stream. Clouds never darkened the sunny sky. Sweet bells never jangled out of tune, and kindred spirits abounded. The knowledge of that land's geography, east of the sun, west of the moon, is priceless lore, not to be bought in any marketplace. It must be the gift of the good fairies at birth, and the years can never deface it or take it away. It is better to possess it, living in a garret, than to be the inhabitant of palaces without it. The Avonlea graveyard was as yet the grass-grown solitude it had always been. To be sure, the improvers had an eye on it, and Priscilla Grant had read a paper on cemeteries before the last meeting of the Society. At some future time, the improvers meant to have the lichened, wayward old board fence replaced by a neat wire railing, the grass mown, and the leaning monuments straightened up. Anne put on Matthew's grave the flowers she had brought for it, and then went over to the little poplar-shaded corner where Hester Gray slept. Ever since the day of the spring picnic, Anne had put flowers on Hester's grave when she visited Matthew's. The evening before, she had made a pilgrimage back to the little deserted garden in the woods, and brought therefrom some of Hester's own white roses. I thought you would like them better than any others, dear, she said softly. Anne was still sitting there when a shadow fell over the grass, and she looked up to see Mrs. Allen. They walked home together. Mrs. Allen's face was not the face of the girl bride whom the minister had brought to Avonlea 5 years before. It had lost some of its bloom and youthful curves, and there were fine, patient lines about eyes and mouth. A tiny grave in that very cemetery accounted for some of them, but some new ones had come during the recent illness, now happily over, of her little son. But Mrs. Allen's dimples were as sweet and sudden as ever, her eyes as clear and bright and true, and what her face lacked of girlish beauty was now more than atoned for in added tenderness and strength. I suppose you are looking forward to your vacation, Anne, she said as they left the graveyard. Anne nodded. Yes, I could roll the word as a sweet morsel under my tongue. I think the summer is going to be lovely. For one thing, Mrs. Morgan is coming to the island in July, and Priscilla is going to bring her up. I feel one of my old thrills at the mere thought. I hope you'll have a good time, Anne. You've worked very hard this past year, and you have succeeded. Oh, I don't know. I've come so far short in so many things. I haven't done what I meant to do when I began to teach last fall. I haven't lived up to my ideals. None of us ever do, said Mrs. Allen with a sigh. But then, Anne, you know what Lowell says. Not failure but low aim is crime. We must have ideals and try to live up to them, even if we never quite succeed. Life would be a sorry business without them. With them it's grand and great. Hold fast to your ideals, Anne." "I shall try, but I have to let go most of my theories," said Anne, laughing a little. "I had the most beautiful set of theories you ever knew when I started out as a schoolmarm, but every one of them has failed me at some pinch or another." "Even the theory on corporal punishment?" teased Mrs. Allen. But Anne flushed. "I shall never forgive myself for whipping Anthony." "Nonsense, dear. He deserved it, and it agreed with him. You have had no trouble with him since, and he has come to think there's nobody like you. Your kindness won his love after the idea that a girl was no good was rooted out of his stubborn mind." "He may have deserved it, but that is not the point. If I had calmly and deliberately decided to whip him because I thought it a just punishment for him, I would not feel over it as I do. But the truth is, Mrs. Allen, that I just flew into a temper and whipped him because of that. I wasn't thinking whether it was just or unjust. Even if he hadn't deserved it, I'd have done it just the same. That is what humiliates me." "Well, we all make mistakes, dear, so just put it behind you. We should regret our mistakes and learn from them, but never carry them forward into the future with us. There goes Gilbert Blythe on his wheel, home for his vacation too, I suppose. How are you and he getting on with your studies?" "Pretty well. We plan to finish the Virgil tonight. There are only 20 lines to do. Then we are not going to study any more until September." "Do you think you will ever get to college?" "Oh, I don't know." Anne looked dreamily afar to the opal-tinted horizon. "Marilla's eyes will never be much better than they are now, although we are so thankful to think that they will not get worse. And then there are the twins. Somehow, I don't believe their uncle will ever really send for them. Perhaps college may be around the bend in the road, but I haven't got to that bend yet, and I don't think much about it lest I might grow discontented." "Well, I should like to see you go to college, Anne. But if you never do, don't be discontented about it. We make our own lives, wherever we are after all. College can only help us to do it more easily. They are broad or narrow according to what we put into them, not what we get out. Life is rich and full here, everywhere, if we can only learn how to open our whole hearts to its richness and fullness." "I think I understand what you mean," said Anne thoughtfully. "And I know I have so much to feel thankful for. Oh, so much. My work, and Paul Irving, and the dear twins, and all my friends. Do you know, Mrs. Allen, I'm so thankful for friendship. It beautifies life so much." "True friendship is a very helpful thing indeed," said Mrs. Allen, "and we should have a very high ideal of it, and never sully it by any failure in truth and sincerity. I fear the name of friendship is often degraded to a kind of intimacy that has nothing of real friendship in it." "Yes, like Gertie Pye's and Julia Bell's. They are very intimate and go everywhere together, but Gertie is always saying nasty things of Julia behind her back, and everybody thinks she is jealous of her because she is always so pleased when anybody criticises Julia. I think it is desecration to call that friendship. If we have friends, we should look only for the best in them and give them the best that is in us, don't you think? Then friendship would be the most beautiful thing in the world." "Friendship is very beautiful," smiled Mrs. Allen. "But some day—" Then she paused abruptly. In the delicate, white-browed face beside her, with its candid eyes and mobile features, there was still far more of the child than of the woman. Anne's heart so far harboured only dreams of friendship and ambition, and Mrs. Allen did not wish to brush the bloom from her sweet unconsciousness. So she left her sentence for the future years to finish. Chapter 16. The Substance of Things Hoped For. "Anne," said Davy appealingly, scrambling up on the shiny, leather-covered sofa in the Green Gables kitchen, where Anne sat reading a letter. "Anne, I'm awful hungry. You've no idea." "I'll get you a piece of bread and butter in a minute," said Anne absently. Her letter evidently contained some exciting news, for her cheeks were as pink as the roses on the big bush outside, and her eyes were as starry as only Anne's eyes could be. "But I ain't bread and butter hungry," said Davy in a disgusted tone. "I'm plum cake hungry." "Oh," laughed Anne, laying down her letter and putting her arm about Davy to give him a squeeze. "That's a kind of hunger that can be endured very comfortably, Davy boy. You know it's one of Marilla's rules that you can't have anything but bread and butter between meals." "Well, give me a piece then." "Please." Davy had been at last taught to say please, but he generally tacked it on as an afterthought. He looked with approval at the generous slice Anne presently brought to him. "You always put a nice lot of butter on it, Anne. Marilla spreads it pretty thin. It slips down a lot easier when there's plenty of butter." The slice slipped down with tolerable ease, judging from its rapid disappearance. Davy slid headfirst off the sofa, turned a double somersault on the rug, and then sat up and announced decidedly, "Anne, I've made up my mind about heaven. I don't want to go there." "Why not?" asked Anne gravely. "'Cause heaven is in Simon Fletcher's garret, and I don't like Simon Fletcher." "Heaven in Simon Fletcher's garret?" gasped Anne, too amazed even to laugh. "Davy Keith, whatever put such an extraordinary idea into your head?" "Milty Boulter says that's where it is. It was last Sunday in Sunday school. The lesson was about Elijah and Elisha, and I up and asked Miss Rogerson where heaven was. Miss Rogerson looked awful offended. She was cross anyhow, because when she'd been asked what Elijah left Elisha when he went to heaven, Milty Boulter said, 'His old clothes,' and us fellows all laughed before we thought. I wish you could think first and do things afterwards, 'cause then you wouldn't always do them. But Milty didn't mean to be disrespectful. He just couldn't think of the name of the thing. Miss Rogerson said heaven was where God was, and I wasn't to ask questions like that. Milty nudged me and said in a whisper, 'Heaven's in Uncle Simon's garret, and I'll explain about it on the road home.' So when we were coming home, he explained. Milty's a great hand at explaining things. Even if he don't know anything about a thing, he'll make up a lot of stuff, and so you get it explained all the same. His mother is Mrs. Simon's sister, and he went with her to the funeral when his cousin, Jane Ellen, died. The minister said she'd gone to heaven, though Milty says she was lying right before them in the coffin. But he supposed they carried the coffin to the garret afterwards. Well, when Milty and his mother went upstairs after it was all over to get her bonnet, he asked her where heaven was that Jane Ellen had gone to, and she pointed right to the ceiling and said, 'Up there.' Milty knew there wasn't anything but the garret over the ceiling, so that's how he found out, and he's been awful scared to go to his Uncle Simon's ever since." Anne took Davy on her knee and did her best to straighten out this theological tangle also. She was much better fitted for the task than Marilla, for she remembered her own childhood and had an instinctive understanding of the curious ideas that 7-year-olds sometimes get about matters that are, of course, very plain and simple to grown-up people. She had just succeeded in convincing Davy that heaven was not in Simon Fletcher's garret when Marilla came in from the garden, where she and Dora had been picking peas. Dora was an industrious little soul, and never happier than when helping in various small tasks suited to her chubby fingers. She fed chickens, picked up chips, wiped dishes, and ran errands galore. She was neat, faithful, and observant. She never had to be told how to do a thing twice, and never forgot any of her little duties. Davy, on the other hand, was rather heedless and forgetful, but he had the born knack of winning love, and even yet Anne and Marilla liked him the better. While Dora proudly shelled the peas and Davy made boats of the pods, with masts of matches and sails of paper, Anne told Marilla about the wonderful contents of her letter. "Oh, Marilla, what do you think? I've had a letter from Priscilla, and she says that Mrs. Morgan is on the island, and that if it is fine Thursday, they are going to drive up to Avonlea and will reach here about 12. They will spend the afternoon with us and go to the hotel at White Sands in the evening, because some of Mrs. Morgan's American friends are staying there. Oh, Marilla, isn't it wonderful? I can hardly believe I'm not dreaming." "I dare say Mrs. Morgan is a lot like other people," said Marilla dryly, although she did feel a trifle excited herself. Mrs. Morgan was a famous woman, and a visit from her was no commonplace occurrence. "They'll be here to dinner, then?" "Yes, and oh, Marilla, may I cook every bit of the dinner myself? I want to feel that I can do something for the author of The Rosebud Garden, if it is only to cook a dinner for her. You won't mind, will you?" "Goodness, I'm not so fond of stewing over a hot fire in July that it would vex me very much to have someone else do it. You're quite welcome to the job." "Oh, thank you," said Anne, as if Marilla had just conferred a tremendous favour. "I'll make out the menu this very night." "You'd better not try to put on too much style," warned Marilla, a little alarmed by the high-flown sound of menu. "You're likely to come to grief if you do." "Oh, I'm not going to put on any style, if you mean trying to do or have things we don't usually have on festal occasions," assured Anne. "That would be affectation, and although I know I haven't as much sense and steadiness as a girl of 17 and a schoolteacher ought to have, I'm not so silly as that. But I want to have everything as nice and dainty as possible. Davy boy, don't leave those pea pods on the back stairs. Someone might slip on them. I'll have a light soup to begin with. You know I can make a lovely cream of onion soup. And then a couple of roast fowls. I'll have the 2 white roosters. I have a real affection for those roosters, and they've been pets ever since the grey hen hatched out just the 2 of them, little balls of yellow down. But I know they would have to be sacrificed sometime, and surely there couldn't be a worthier occasion than this. But, oh, Marilla, I cannot kill them, not even for Mrs. Morgan's sake. I'll have to ask John Henry Carter to come over and do it for me." "I'll do it," volunteered Davy, "if Marilla'll hold them by the legs, 'cause I guess it'd take both my hands to manage the axe. It's awful jolly fun to see them hopping about after their heads are cut off. Then I'll have peas and beans and creamed potatoes and a lettuce salad for vegetables," resumed Anne. "And for dessert, lemon pie with whipped cream and coffee and cheese and lady fingers. I'll make the pies and lady fingers tomorrow and do up my white muslin dress. And I must tell Diana tonight, for she'll want to do up hers. Mrs. Morgan's heroines are nearly always dressed in white muslin, and Diana and I have always resolved that that was what we would wear if we ever met her. It will be such a delicate compliment, don't you think? Davy, dear, you mustn't poke pea pods into the cracks of the floor. I must ask Mr. and Mrs. Allen and Miss Stacy to dinner too, for they're all very anxious to meet Mrs. Morgan. It's so fortunate she's coming while Miss Stacy is here. Davy, dear, don't sail the pea pods in the water bucket. Go out to the trough. Oh, I do hope it will be fine Thursday, and I think it will, for Uncle Abe said last night when he called at Mr. Harrison's that it was going to rain most of this week." "That's a good sign," agreed Marilla. Anne ran across to Orchard Slope that evening to tell the news to Diana, who was also very much excited over it, and they discussed the matter in the hammock swung under the big willow in the Barry garden. "Oh, Anne, mayn't I help you cook the dinner?" implored Diana. "You know I can make a splendid lettuce salad." "Indeed you may," said Anne unselfishly, "and I shall want you to help me decorate too. I mean to have the parlour simply a bower of blossoms, and the dining table is to be adorned with wild roses. Oh, I do hope everything will go smoothly. Mrs. Morgan's heroines never get into scrapes or are taken at a disadvantage, and they are always so self-possessed and such good housekeepers. They seem to be born good housekeepers. You remember that Gertrude in Edgewood Days kept house for her father when she was only 8 years old? When I was 8 years old, I hardly knew how to do a thing except bring up children. Mrs. Morgan must be an authority on girls when she has written so much about them, and I do want her to have a good opinion of us. I've imagined it all out a dozen different ways. What she'll look like, and what she'll say, and what I'll say. And I'm so anxious about my nose. There are 7 freckles on it, as you can see. They came at the Avis picnic, when I went around in the sun without my hat. I suppose it's ungrateful of me to worry over them, when I should be thankful they're not spread all over my face as they once were. But I do wish they hadn't come. All Mrs. Morgan's heroines have such perfect complexions. I can't recall a freckled one among them. Yours are not very noticeable, comforted Diana. Try a little lemon juice on them tonight. The next day Anne made her pies and lady fingers, did up her muslin dress, and swept and dusted every room in the house, a quite unnecessary proceeding, for Green Gables was, as usual, in the apple pie order dear to Marilla's heart. But Anne felt that a fleck of dust would be a desecration in a house that was to be honoured by a visit from Charlotte E. Morgan. She even cleaned out the catch-all closet under the stairs, although there was not the remotest possibility of Mrs. Morgan seeing its interior. But I want to feel that it is in perfect order, even if she isn't to see it, Anne told Marilla. You know, in her book, Golden Keys, she makes her 2 heroines, Alice and Louisa, take for their motto that verse of Longfellow's. In the elder days of art, builders wrought with greatest care, each minute an unseen part, for the gods see everywhere. And so they always kept their cellar stairs scrubbed and never forgot to sweep under the beds. I should have a guilty conscience if I thought this closet was in disorder when Mrs. Morgan was in the house. Ever since we read Golden Keys last April, Diana and I have taken that verse for our motto too. That night, John Henry Carter and Davy between them contrived to execute the 2 white roosters, and Anne dressed them, the unusual distasteful task glorified in her eyes by the destination of the plump birds. I don't like picking fowls, she told Marilla, but isn't it fortunate we don't have to put our souls into what our hands may be doing? I've been picking chickens with my hands, but in imagination I've been roaming the Milky Way. I thought you'd scattered more feathers over the floor than usual, remarked Marilla. Then Anne put Davy to bed and made him promise that he would behave perfectly the next day. If I'm as good can be all day tomorrow, will you let me be just as bad as I like all the next day? Asked Davy. I couldn't do that, said Anne discreetly. But I'll take you and Dora for a row in the flat, right to the bottom of the pond, and we'll go ashore on the sandhills and have a picnic. It's a bargain, said Davy. I'll be good, you bet. I meant to go over to Mr. Harrison's and fire peas from my new pop gun at Ginger, but another day'll do as well. I expect it'll just be like Sunday, but a picnic at the shore'll make up for that. Chapter 17. A Chapter of Accidents. Anne woke 3 times in the night and made pilgrimages to her window to make sure that Uncle Abe's prediction was not coming true. Finally, the morning dawned pearly and lustrous in a sky full of silver sheen and radiance, and the wonderful day had arrived. Diana appeared soon after breakfast, with a basket of flowers over one arm and her muslin dress over the other, for it would not do to don it until all the dinner preparations were completed. Meanwhile, she wore her afternoon pink print and a lawn apron fearfully and wonderfully ruffled and frilled, and very neat and pretty and rosy she was. You look simply sweet, said Anne admiringly. Diana sighed. But I've had to let out every one of my dresses again. I weigh 4 pounds more than I did in July. Anne, where will this end? Mrs. Morgan's heroines are all tall and slender. Well, let's forget our troubles and think of our mercies, said Anne gaily. Mrs. Allen says that whenever we think of anything that is a trial to us, we should also think of something nice that we can set over against it. If you are slightly too plump, you've got the dearest dimples, and if I have a freckled nose, the shape of it is all right. Do you think the lemon juice did any good? Yes, I really think it did, said Diana critically, and much elated, Anne led the way to the garden, which was full of airy shadows and wavering golden lights. We'll decorate the parlour first. We have plenty of time, for Priscilla said they'll be here about 12 or past at the latest, so we'll have dinner at 1. There may have been 2 happier and more excited girls somewhere in Canada or the United States at that moment, but I doubt it. Every snip of the scissors, as Rose and Peony and Bluebell fell, seemed to chirp, "Mrs. Morgan is coming today." Anne wondered how Mr. Harrison could go on placidly mowing hay in the field across the lane, just as if nothing were going to happen. The parlour at Green Gables was a rather severe and gloomy apartment, with rigid horsehair furniture, stiff lace curtains, and white antimacassars that were always laid at a perfectly correct angle, except at such times as they clung to unfortunate people's buttons. Even Anne had never been able to infuse much grace into it, for Marilla would not permit any alterations. But it is wonderful what flowers can accomplish if you give them a fair chance. When Anne and Diana finished with the room, you would not have recognized it. A great blue bowlful of snowballs overflowed on the polished table. The shining black mantelpiece was heaped with roses and ferns. Every shelf of the whatnot held a sheaf of bluebells. The dark corners on either side of the grate were lighted up with jars full of glowing crimson peonies, and the grate itself was aflame with yellow poppies. All this splendour and colour mingled with the sunshine falling through the honeysuckle vines at the window in a leafy riot of dancing shadows over walls and floor, made of the usually dismal little room the veritable bower of Anne's imagination, and even extorted a tribute of admiration from Marilla, who came in to criticize and remained to praise. "Now we must set the table," said Anne, in the tone of a priestess about to perform some sacred rite in honour of a divinity. "We'll have a big vase full of wild roses in the centre, and 1 single rose in front of everybody's plate, and a special bouquet of rosebuds only by Mrs. Morgan's, an allusion to the rosebud garden, you know." The table was set in the sitting-room, with Marilla's finest linen and the best china, glass, and silver. You may be perfectly certain that every article placed on it was polished or scoured to the highest possible perfection of gloss and glitter. Then the girls tripped out to the kitchen, which was filled with appetizing odours emanating from the oven, where the chickens were already sizzling splendidly. Anne prepared the potatoes, and Diana got the peas and beans ready. Then, while Diana shut herself into the pantry to compound the lettuce salad, Anne, whose cheeks were already beginning to grow crimson, as much with excitement as from the heat of the fire, prepared the bread sauce for the chickens, minced her onions for the soup, and finally whipped the cream for her lemon pies. And what about Davy all this time? Was he redeeming his promise to be good? He was indeed. To be sure, he insisted on remaining in the kitchen, for his curiosity wanted to see all that went on. But as he sat quietly in a corner, busily engaged in untying the knots in a piece of herring net he had brought home from his last trip to the shore, nobody objected to this. At 11:30, the lettuce salad was made. The golden circles of the pies were heaped with whipped cream, and everything was sizzling and bubbling that ought to sizzle and bubble. "We'd better go and dress now," said Anne, "for they may be here by 12. We must have dinner at sharp 1, for the soup must be served as soon as it's done." Serious indeed were the toilet rites presently performed in the east gable. Anne peered anxiously at her nose and rejoiced to see that its freckles were not at all prominent, thanks either to the lemon juice or to the unusual flush on her cheeks. When they were ready, they looked quite as sweet and trim and girlish as ever did any of Mrs. Morgan's heroines. "I do hope I'll be able to say something once in a while, and not sit like a mute," said Diana anxiously. "All Mrs. Morgan's heroines converse so beautifully, but I'm afraid I'll be tongue-tied and stupid. And I'll be sure to say, 'I seen.' I haven't often said it since Miss Stacy taught here, but in moments of excitement it's sure to pop out. Anne, if I were to say 'I seen' before Mrs. Morgan, I'd die of mortification. And it would be almost as bad to have nothing to say." "I'm nervous about a good many things," said Anne, "but I don't think there is much fear that I won't be able to talk." And to do her justice, there wasn't. Anne shrouded her muslin glories in a big apron and went down to concoct her soup. Marilla had dressed herself and the twins, and looked more excited than she had ever been known to look before. At 12:30, the Allens and Miss Stacy came. Everything was going well, but Anne was beginning to feel nervous. It was surely time for Priscilla and Mrs. Morgan to arrive. She made frequent trips to the gate and looked as anxiously down the lane as ever her namesake in the Bluebeard story peered from the tower casement. "Suppose they don't come at all," she said piteously. "Don't suppose it. It would be too mean," said Diana, who, however, was beginning to have uncomfortable misgivings on the subject. "Anne," said Marilla, coming out from the parlour, "Miss Stacy wants to see Miss Barry's willow-ware platter." Anne hastened to the sitting-room closet to get the platter. She had, in accordance with her promise to Mrs. Lynde, written to Miss Barry of Charlottetown, asking for the loan of it. Miss Barry was an old friend of Anne's, and she promptly sent the platter out, with a letter exhorting Anne to be very careful of it, for she had paid $20 for it. The platter had served its purpose at the Aid Bazaar, and had then been returned to the Green Gables closet, for Anne would not trust anybody but herself to take it back to town. She carried the platter carefully to the front door, where her guests were enjoying the cool breeze that blew up from the brook. It was examined and admired. Then, just as Anne had taken it back into her own hands, a terrific crash and clatter sounded from the kitchen pantry. Marilla, Diana, and Anne fled out, the latter pausing only long enough to set the precious platter hastily down on the second step of the stairs. When they reached the pantry, a truly harrowing spectacle met their eyes. A guilty-looking small boy, scrambling down from the table, with his clean print blouse liberally plastered with yellow filling, and on the table the shattered remnants of what had been 2 brave, becreamed lemon pies. Davy had finished ravelling out his herring net and had wound the twine into a ball. Then he had gone into the pantry to put it up on the shelf above the table, where he already kept a score or so of similar balls, which, so far as could be discovered, served no useful purpose save to yield the joy of possession. Davy had to climb on the table and reach over to the shelf at a dangerous angle, something he had been forbidden by Marilla to do, as he had come to grief once before in the experiment. The result in this instance was disastrous. Davy slipped and came sprawling squarely down on the lemon pies. His clean blouse was ruined for that time, and the pies for all time. It is, however, an ill wind that blows nobody good, and the pig was eventually the gainer by Davy's mischance. "Davy Keith," said Marilla, shaking him by the shoulder. "Didn't I forbid you to climb on that table again, didn't I?" "I forgot," whimpered Davy. You've told me not to do such an awful lot of things that I can't remember them all." "Well, you march upstairs and stay there till after dinner. Perhaps you'll get them sorted out of your memory by that time." "No, Anne, never you mind interceding for him. I'm not punishing him because he spoiled your pies. That was an accident. I'm punishing him for his disobedience. Go, Davy, I say." "Ain't I to have any dinner?" wailed Davy. "You can come down after dinner is over and have yours in the kitchen." "Oh, all right," said Davy, somewhat comforted. "I know Anne'll save some nice bones for me, won't you, Anne? Because you know I didn't mean to fall on the pies. Say, Anne, since they are spoilt, can't I take some of the pieces upstairs with me?" "No, no lemon pie for you, Master Davy," said Marilla, pushing him toward the hall. "What shall we do for dessert?" asked Anne, looking regretfully at the wreck and ruin. "Get out a crock of strawberry preserves," said Marilla consolingly. "There's plenty of whipped cream left in the bowl for it." 1 o'clock came, but no Priscilla or Mrs. Morgan. Anne was in an agony. Everything was done to a turn, and the soup was just what soup should be, but couldn't be depended on to remain so for any length of time. "I don't believe they're coming after all," said Marilla crossly. Anne and Diana sought comfort in each other's eyes. At 1:30, Marilla again emerged from the parlour. "Girls, we must have dinner. Everybody is hungry, and it's no use waiting any longer. Priscilla and Mrs. Morgan are not coming, that's plain, and nothing is being improved by waiting." Anne and Diana set about lifting the dinner, with all the zest gone out of the performance. "I don't believe I'll be able to eat a mouthful," said Diana dolefully. "Nor I, but I hope everything will be nice for Miss Stacy's and Mr. and Mrs. Allen's sakes," said Anne, listlessly. When Diana dished the peas, she tasted them, and a very peculiar expression crossed her face. "Anne, did you put sugar in these peas?" "Yes," said Anne, mashing the potatoes with the air of one expected to do her duty. "I put a spoonful of sugar in. We always do. Don't you like it?" "But I put a spoonful in too when I set them on the stove," said Diana. Anne dropped her masher and tasted the peas also. Then she made a grimace. "How awful! I never dreamed you had put sugar in, because I knew your mother never does. I happened to think of it for a wonder. I'm always forgetting it. So I popped a spoonful in." "It's a case of too many cooks, I guess," said Marilla, who had listened to this dialogue with a rather guilty expression. "I didn't think you'd remember about the sugar, Anne, for I'm perfectly certain you never did before. So I put in a spoonful." The guests in the parlour heard peal after peal of laughter from the kitchen, but they never knew what the fun was about. There were no green peas on the dinner table that day, however. "Well," said Anne, sobering down again with a sigh of recollection, "we have the salad anyhow, and I don't think anything has happened to the beans. Let's carry the things in and get it over." It cannot be said that the dinner was a notable success socially. The Allens and Miss Stacy exerted themselves to save the situation, and Marilla's customary placidity was not noticeably ruffled. But Anne and Diana, between their disappointment and the reaction from their excitement of the forenoon, could neither talk nor eat. Anne tried heroically to bear her part in the conversation for the sake of her guests, but all the sparkle had been quenched in her for the time being. And, in spite of her love for the Allens and Miss Stacy, she couldn't help thinking how nice it would be when everybody had gone home and she could bury her weariness and disappointment in the pillows of the east gable. There is an old proverb that really seems at times to be inspired. It never rains but it pours. the measure of that day's tribulations was not yet full. Just as Mr. Allen had finished returning thanks, there arose a strange, ominous sound on the stairs, as of some hard, heavy object bounding from step to step, finishing up with a grand smash at the bottom. Everybody ran out into the hall. Anne gave a shriek of dismay. At the bottom of the stairs lay a big pink conch shell amid the fragments of what had been Miss Barry's platter, and at the top of the stairs knelt a terrified Davy, gazing down with wide-open eyes at the havoc. "Davy," said Marilla ominously, "did you throw that conch down on purpose?" "No, I never did," whimpered Davy. "I was just kneeling here, quiet as quiet, to watch you folks through the banisters, and my foot struck the old thing and pushed it off. And I'm awful hungry, and I do wish you'd lick a fellow and have done with it, instead of always sending him upstairs to miss all the fun." "Don't blame Davy," said Anne, gathering up the fragments with trembling fingers. "It was my fault. I set that platter there and forgot all about it. I am properly punished for my carelessness. But oh, what will Miss Barry say?" "Well, you know she only bought it, so it isn't the same as if it were an heirloom," said Diana, trying to console. The guests went away soon after, feeling that it was the most tactful thing to do, and Anne and Diana washed the dishes, talking less than they had ever been known to do before. Then Diana went home with a headache, and Anne went with another to the East Gable, where she stayed until Marilla came home from the post office at sunset with a letter from Priscilla, written the day before. Mrs. Morgan had sprained her ankle so severely that she could not leave her room. "And, oh, Anne dear," wrote Priscilla, "I'm so sorry, but I'm afraid we won't get up to Green Gables at all now, for by the time Auntie's ankle is well, she will have to go back to Toronto. She has to be there by a certain date." "Well," sighed Anne, laying the letter down on the red sandstone step of the back porch, where she was sitting, while the twilight rained down out of a dappled sky. "I always thought it was too good to be true that Mrs. Morgan should really come. But there, that speech sounds as pessimistic as Miss Eliza Andrews, and I'm ashamed of making it. After all, it was not too good to be true. Things just as good and far better are coming true for me all the time. And I suppose the events of today have a funny side too. Perhaps when Diana and I are old and grey, we shall be able to laugh over them. But I feel I can't expect to do it before then, for it has truly been a bitter disappointment." "You'll probably have a good many more and worse disappointments than that before you get through life," said Marilla, who honestly thought she was making a comforting speech. "It seems to me, Anne, that you are never going to outgrow your fashion of setting your heart so on things, and then crashing down into despair because you don't get them." "I know I'm too much inclined that way," agreed Anne ruefully. "When I think something nice is going to happen, I seem to fly right up on the wings of anticipation, and then the first thing I realise I drop down to earth with a thud. But really, Marilla, the flying part is glorious as long as it lasts. It's like soaring through a sunset. I think it almost pays for the thud." "Well, maybe it does," admitted Marilla. "I'd rather walk calmly along and do without both flying and thud. But everybody has their own way of living. I used to think there was only one right way, but since I've had you and the twins to bring up, I don't feel so sure of it. What are you going to do about Miss Barry's platter?" "Pay her back the $20 she paid for it, I suppose. I'm so thankful it wasn't a cherished heirloom, because then no money could replace it. Maybe you could find one like it somewhere and buy it for her." "I'm afraid not. Platters as old as that are very scarce. Mrs. Lynde couldn't find one anywhere for the supper. I only wish I could, for of course Miss Barry would just as soon have one platter as another if both were equally old and genuine. Marilla, look at that big star over Mr. Harrison's maple grove, with all that holy hush of silvery sky about it. It gives me a feeling that it is like a prayer. After all, when one can see stars and skies like that, little disappointments and accidents can't matter so much, can they? "Where's Davy?" said Marilla, with an indifferent glance at the star. "In bed. I've promised to take him and Dora to the shore for a picnic tomorrow. Of course, the original agreement was that he must be good. But he tried to be good, and I hadn't the heart to disappoint him." "You'll drown yourself or the twins rowing about the pond in that flat," grumbled Marilla. "I've lived here for 60 years and I've never been on that pond yet." "Well, it's never too late to mend," said Anne roguishly. "Suppose you come with us tomorrow. We'll shut Green Gables up and spend the whole day at the shore, daffing the world aside." "No, thank you," said Marilla with indignant emphasis. "I'd be a nice sight, wouldn't I, rowing down the pond in a flat? I think I hear Rachel pronouncing on it. There's Mr. Harrison driving away somewhere. Do you suppose there is any truth in the gossip that Mr. Harrison is going to see Isabella Andrews?" "No, I'm sure there isn't. He just called there one evening on business with Mr. Harmon Andrews, and Mrs. Lynde saw him and said she knew he was courting because he had a white collar on. I don't believe Mr. Harrison will ever marry. He seems to have a prejudice against marriage." "Well, you can never tell about those old bachelors. And if he had a white collar on, I'd agree with Rachel that it looks suspicious, for I'm sure he never was seen with one before." "I think he only put it on because he wants to conclude a business deal with Harmon Andrews," said Anne. "I've heard him say that's the only time a man needs to be particular about his appearance. Because if he looks prosperous, the party of the second part won't be so likely to try to cheat him. I really feel sorry for Mr. Harrison. I don't believe he feels satisfied with his life. It must be very lonely to have no one to care about except a parrot, don't you think? But I notice Mr. Harrison doesn't like to be pitied. Nobody does, I imagine." "Here's Gilbert coming up the lane," said Marilla. "If he wants you to go for a row on the pond, mind, you put on your coat and rubbers. There's a heavy dew tonight." Chapter 18. An Adventure on the Tory Road. "Anne," said Davy, sitting up in bed and propping his chin on his hands. "Anne, where is sleep? People go to sleep every night, and of course I know it's the place where I do things I dream, but I want to know where it is and how I get there and back without knowing anything about it. And in my nightie too. Where is it?" Anne was kneeling at the west gable window, watching the sunset sky that was like a great flower with petals of crocus and a heart of fiery yellow. She turned her head at Davy's question and answered dreamily, "Over the mountains of the moon, down the valley of the shadow." Paul Irving would have known the meaning of this, or made a meaning out of it for himself, if he didn't. But practical Davy, who, as Anne often despairingly remarked, hadn't a particle of imagination, was only puzzled and disgusted. "Anne, I believe you're just talking nonsense." "Of course I was, dear boy. Don't you know it is only very foolish folk who talk sense all the time? Well, I think you might give a sensible answer when I ask a sensible question," said Davy, in an injured tone. "Oh, you are too little to understand," said Anne. But she felt rather ashamed of saying it, for had she not, in keen remembrance of many similar snubs administered in her own early years, solemnly vowed that she would never tell any child it was too little to understand. Yet here she was doing it. So wide sometimes is the gulf between theory and practice. "Well, I'm doing my best to grow," said Davy. But it's a thing you can't hurry much. If Marilla wasn't so stingy with her jam, I believe I'd grow a lot faster." "Marilla is not stingy, Davy," said Anne severely. "It is very ungrateful of you to say such a thing." "There's another word that means the same thing, and sounds a lot better, but I just don't remember it," said Davy, frowning intently. "I heard Marilla say she was it, herself the other day." "If you mean economical, it's a very different thing from being stingy. It is an excellent trait in a person if she is economical. If Marilla had been stingy, she wouldn't have taken you and Dora when your mother died. Would you have liked to live with Mrs. Wiggins?" "You just bet I wouldn't." Davy was emphatic on that point. "No, I don't want to go out to Uncle Richard neither. I'd far rather live here, even if Marilla is that long-tailed word when it comes to jam, 'cause you're here, Anne. Say, Anne, won't you tell me a story before I go to sleep? I don't want a fairy story. They're all right for girls, I suppose, but I want something exciting. Lots of killing and shooting in it, and a house on fire, and interesting things like that." Fortunately for Anne, Marilla called out at this moment from her room. "Anne, Diana's signalling at a great rate. You'd better see what she wants." Anne ran to the east gable and saw flashes of light coming through the twilight from Diana's window in groups of 5, which meant, according to their old childish code, "Come over at once, for I have something important to reveal." Anne threw her white shawl over her head and hastened through the haunted wood and across Mr. Bell's pasture corner to Orchard Slope. "I've good news for you, Anne," said Diana. "Mother and I have just got home from Carmody, and I saw Mary Sentner from Spencer Vale in Mr. Blair's store. She says the old Copp girls on the Tory Road have a willow-ware platter, and she thinks it's exactly like the one we had at the supper. She says they'll likely sell it, for Martha Copp has never been known to keep anything she could sell. But if they won't, there's a platter at Wesley Keeson's at Spencer Vale, and she knows they'd sell it. But she isn't sure it's just the same kind as Aunt Josephine's." "I'll go right over to Spencer Vale after it tomorrow," said Anne resolutely, "and you must come with me. It will be such a weight off my mind, for I have to go to town day after tomorrow, and how can I face your Aunt Josephine without a willow-ware platter? It would be even worse than the time I had to confess about jumping on the spare-room bed." Both girls laughed over the old memory, concerning which, if any of my readers are ignorant and curious, I must refer them to Anne's earlier history. The next afternoon, the girls fared forth on their platter hunting expedition. It was 10 miles to Spencer Vale, and the day was not especially pleasant for travelling. It was very warm and windless, and the dust on the road was such as might have been expected after 6 weeks of dry weather. "Oh, I do wish it would rain soon," sighed Anne. "Everything is so parched up. The poor fields just seem pitiful to me, and the trees seem to be stretching out their hands, pleading for rain. As for my garden, it hurts me every time I go into it. I suppose I shouldn't complain about a garden when the farmer's crops are suffering so. Mr. Harrison says his pastures are so scorched up that his poor cows can hardly get a bite to eat, and he feels guilty of cruelty to animals every time he meets their eyes." After a wearisome drive, the girls reached Spencer Vale and turned down the Tory Road, a green, solitary highway where the strips of grass between the wheel tracks bore evidence to lack of travel. Along most of its extent, it was lined with thick-set young spruces crowding down to the roadway, with here and there a break where the back field of a Spencer Vale farm came out to the fence, or an expanse of stumps was aflame with fireweed and goldenrod. "Why is it called the Tory Road?" asked Anne. "Mr. Allen says it is on the principle of calling a place a grove because there are no trees in it," said Diana. "For nobody lives along the road except the Copp girls, and old Martin Bovyer at the further end, who is a Liberal. The Tory government ran the road through when they were in power, just to show they were doing something. Diana's father was a Liberal, for which reason she and Anne never discussed politics. Green Gables folk had always been Conservatives. Finally, the girls came to the old Copp homestead, a place of such exceeding external neatness that even Green Gables would have suffered by contrast. The house was a very old-fashioned one, situated on a slope, which fact had necessitated the building of a stone basement under one end. The house and outbuildings were all whitewashed to a condition of blinding perfection, and not a weed was visible in the prim kitchen garden surrounded by its white paling. "The shades are all down," said Diana ruefully. "I believe that nobody is home." This proved to be the case. The girls looked at each other in perplexity. "I don't know what to do," said Anne. "If I was sure the platter was the right kind, I would not mind waiting until they came home. But if it isn't, it may be too late to go to Wesley Keeson's afterward." Diana looked at a certain little square window over the basement. "That is the pantry window, I feel sure," she said, "because this house is just like Uncle Charles's at Newbridge, and that is their pantry window. The shade isn't down, so if we climbed up on the roof of that little house, we could look into the pantry and might be able to see the platter. Do you think it would be any harm?" "No, I don't think so," decided Anne, after due reflection, "since our motive is not idle curiosity." This important point of ethics being settled, Anne prepared to mount the aforesaid little house, a construction of laths with a peaked roof, which had in times past served as a habitation for ducks. The Copp girls had given up keeping ducks, because they were such untidy birds, and the house had not been in use for some years, save as an abode of correction for setting hens. Although scrupulously whitewashed, it had become somewhat shaky, and Anne felt rather dubious as she scrambled up from the vantage point of a keg placed on a box. "I'm afraid it won't bear my weight," she said, as she gingerly stepped on the roof. "Lean on the window-sill," advised Diana, and Anne accordingly leaned. Much to her delight, she saw, as she peered through the pane, a willow-ware platter, exactly such as she was in quest of, on the shelf in front of the window. So much she saw before the catastrophe came. In her joy, Anne forgot the precarious nature of her footing, incautiously ceased to lean on the window-sill, gave an impulsive little hop of pleasure, and the next moment she had crashed through the roof up to her armpits, and there she hung, quite unable to extricate herself. Diana dashed into the duck-house, and, seizing her unfortunate friend by the waist, tried to draw her down. "Ow, don't!" shrieked poor Anne. "There are some long splinters sticking into me. See if you can put something under my feet, then perhaps I can draw myself up." Diana hastily dragged in the previously mentioned keg, and Anne found that it was just sufficiently high to furnish a secure resting place for her feet, but she could not release herself. "Could I pull you out if I crawled up?" suggested Diana. Anne shook her head hopelessly. "No, the splinters hurt too badly. If you can find an axe, you might chop me out, though. Oh dear, I do really begin to believe that I was born under an ill-omened star." Diana searched faithfully, but no axe was to be found. "I'll have to go for help," she said, returning to the prisoner. "No, indeed you won't," said Anne vehemently. "If you do, the story of this will get out everywhere, and I shall be ashamed to show my face. No, we must just wait until the Copp girls come home and bind them to secrecy. They'll know where the axe is and get me out. I'm not uncomfortable, as long as I keep perfectly still, Not uncomfortable in body, I mean. I wonder what the Copp girls value this house at. I shall have to pay for the damage I've done, but I wouldn't mind that if I was only sure they would understand my motive in peeping in at their pantry window. My sole comfort is that the platter is just the kind I want, and if Miss Copp will only sell it to me, I shall be resigned to what has happened. What if the Copp girls don't come home until after night, or till tomorrow? Suggested Diana. If they're not back by sunset, you'll have to go for some other assistance, I suppose, said Anne reluctantly. But you mustn't go until you really have to. Oh dear, this is a dreadful predicament. I wouldn't mind my misfortunes so much if they were romantic, as Mrs. Morgan's heroines always are, but they are always just simply ridiculous. Fancy what the Copp girls will think when they drive into their yard and see a girl's head and shoulders sticking out of the roof of one of their outhouses. Listen, is that a wagon? No, Diana, I believe it is thunder. Thunder it was undoubtedly, and Diana, having made a hasty pilgrimage around the house, returned to announce that a very black cloud was rising rapidly in the northwest. I believe we're going to have a heavy thunder shower, she exclaimed in dismay. Oh, Anne, what will we do? We must prepare for it, said Anne tranquilly. A thunderstorm seemed a trifle in comparison with what had already happened. You'd better drive the horse and buggy into that open shed. Fortunately, my parasol is in the buggy. Here, take my hat with you. Marilla told me I was a goose to put on my best hat to come to the Tory road, and she was right, as she always is. Diana untied the pony and drove into the shed, just as the first heavy drops of rain fell. There she sat and watched the resulting downpour, which was so thick and heavy that she could hardly see Anne through it, holding the parasol bravely over her bare head. There was not a great deal of thunder, but for the best part of an hour the rain came merrily down. Occasionally Anne slanted back her parasol and waved an encouraging hand to her friend, but conversation at that distance was quite out of the question. Finally the rain ceased, the sun came out, and Diana ventured across the puddles of the yard. "Did you get very wet?" she asked anxiously. "Oh, no," returned Anne cheerfully. "My head and shoulders are quite dry, and my skirt is only a little damp where the rain beat through the lathes. Don't pity me, Diana, for I haven't minded it at all. I kept thinking how much good the rain will do, and how glad my garden must be for it, and imagining what the flowers and buds would think when the drops began to fall. I imagined out a most interesting dialogue between the asters and the sweet peas and the wild canaries in the lilac bush and the guardian spirit of the garden. When I go home, I mean to write it down. I wish I had a pencil and paper to do it now, because I dare say I'll forget the best parts before I reach home." Diana the faithful had a pencil and discovered a sheet of wrapping paper in the box of the buggy. Anne folded up her dripping parasol, put on her hat, spread the wrapping paper on a shingle Diana handed up, and wrote out her garden idyll under conditions that could hardly be considered as favourable to literature. Nevertheless, the result was quite pretty, and Diana was enraptured when Anne read it to her. "Oh, Anne, it's sweet, just sweet. Do send it to the Canadian woman." Anne shook her head. "Oh, no, it wouldn't be suitable at all. There is no plot in it. You see, it's just a string of fancies. I like writing such things, but of course nothing of the sort would ever do for publication, for editors insist on plots, so Priscilla says. Oh, there's Miss Sarah Copp now. Please, Diana, go and explain." Miss Sarah Copp was a small person, garbed in shabby black, with a hat chosen less for vain adornment than of qualities that would wear well. She looked as amazed as might be expected on seeing the curious tableau in her yard, but when she heard Diana's explanation, she was all sympathy. She hurriedly unlocked the back door, produced the axe, and with a few skillful blows set Anne free. The latter, somewhat tired and stiff, ducked down into the interior of her prison and thankfully emerged into liberty once more. "Miss Copp," she said earnestly, "I assure you I looked into your pantry window only to discover if you had a willow-ware platter. I didn't see anything else. I didn't look for anything else." "Bless you, that's all right," said Miss Sarah amiably. "You needn't worry, there's no harm done. Thank goodness we Copps keep our pantries presentable at all times and don't care who sees them. As for that old duck house, I'm glad it's smashed, for maybe now Martha will agree to have it taken down. She never would before, for fear it might come in handy sometime, and I've had to whitewash it every spring. But you might as well argue with a post as with Martha. She went to town today. I drove her to the station. And you want to buy my platter. Well, what will you give for it?" $20, said Anne, who was never meant to match business wits with a Copp, or she would not have offered her price at the start. "Well, I'll see," said Miss Sarah cautiously. "That platter is mine, fortunately, or I'd never dare to sell it when Martha wasn't here. As it is, I dare say she'll raise a fuss. Martha's the boss of this establishment, I can tell you. I'm getting awful tired of living under another woman's thumb. But come in, come in. You must be real tired and hungry. I'll do the best I can for you in the way of tea, but I warn you not to expect anything but bread and butter and some cowcumbers. Martha locked up all the cake and cheese and preserves afore she went. She always does, because she says I'm too extravagant with them if company comes." The girls were hungry enough to do justice to any fare, and they enjoyed Miss Sarah's excellent bread and butter and cowcumbers thoroughly. When the meal was over, Miss Sarah said, "I don't know as I mind selling the platter, but it's worth $25. It's a very old platter." Diana gave Anne's foot a gentle kick under the table, meaning, "Don't agree, she'll let it go for 20 if you hold out." But Anne was not minded to take any chances in regard to that precious platter. She promptly agreed to give 25, and Miss Sarah looked as if she felt sorry she hadn't asked for 30. "Well, I guess you may have it. I want all the money I can scare up just now. The fact is—" Miss Sarah threw up her head importantly, with a proud flush on her thin cheeks. "I'm going to be married to Luther Wallace. He wanted me 20 years ago. I liked him real well, but he was poor then and father packed him off. I suppose I shouldn't have let him go so meek, but I was timid and frightened of father. Besides, I didn't know men were so scarce." When the girls were safely away, Diana driving and Anne holding the coveted platter carefully on her lap, the green, rain-freshened solitudes of the Tory road were enlivened by ripples of girlish laughter. "I'll amuse your Aunt Josephine with the strange eventful history of this afternoon when I go to town tomorrow. We've had a rather trying time, but it's over now. I've got the platter, and that rain has laid the dust beautifully. So all's well that ends well." "We're not home yet," said Diana, rather pessimistically. "And there's no telling what might happen before we are. You're such a girl to have adventures, Anne." "Having adventures comes natural to some people," said Anne serenely. "You just have a gift for them. Or you haven't." Chapter 19. Just a Happy Day. "After all," Anne had said to Marilla once, "I believe the nicest and sweetest days are not those on which anything very splendid or wonderfully or exciting happens, but just those that bring simple little pleasures, following one another softly, like pearls slipping off a string." Life at Green Gables was full of just such days, for Anne's adventures and misadventures, like those of other people, did not all happen at once, but were sprinkled over the year, with long stretches of harmless, happy days between, filled with work and dreams and laughter and lessons. Such a day came late in August. In the forenoon, Anne and Diana rowed the delighted twins down the pond to the sandshore to pick sweet grass and paddle in the surf, over which the wind was harping an old lyric learned when the world was young. In the afternoon, Anne walked to the old Irving place to see Paul. She found him stretched out on the grassy bank beside the thick fir grove that sheltered the house on the north, absorbed in a book of fairy tales. He sprang up radiantly at sight of her. "Oh, I'm so glad you've come, teacher," he said eagerly, "because Grandma's away. You'll stay and have tea with me, won't you? It's so lonesome to have tea all by oneself. You know, teacher, I've had serious thoughts of asking young Mary Jo to sit down and eat her tea with me, but I expect Grandma wouldn't approve. She says the French have to be kept in their place. And anyhow, it's difficult to talk with young Mary Jo. She just laughs and says, 'Well, yous do beat up all the kids I ever knowed.' That isn't my idea of conversation." "Of course I'll stay to tea," said Anne gaily. "I was dying to be asked. My mouth has been watering for some of your Grandma's delicious shortbread ever since I had tea here before." Paul looked very sober. "If it depended on me, teacher," he said, standing before Anne with his hands in his pockets and his beautiful little face shadowed with sudden care, "you should have shortbread with a right good will. But it depends on Mary Jo. I heard Grandma tell her before she left that she wasn't to give me any shortcake because it was too rich for little boys' stomachs. But maybe Mary Jo will cut some for you if I promise I won't eat any. Let us hope for the best." "Yes, let us," agreed Anne, whom this cheerful philosophy suited exactly. "And if Mary Jo proves hard-hearted and won't give me any shortbread, it doesn't matter in the least, so you are not to worry over that." "You're sure you won't mind if she doesn't?" said Paul anxiously. "Perfectly sure, dear heart." "Then I won't worry," said Paul with a long breath of relief, "especially as I really think Mary Jo will listen to reason. She's not a naturally unreasonable person, but she has learned by experience that it doesn't do to disobey Grandma's orders. Grandma is an excellent woman, but people must do as she tells them. She was very much pleased with me this morning because I managed at last to eat all my plateful of porridge. It was a great effort, but I succeeded. Grandma says she thinks she'll make a man of me yet. But, teacher, I want to ask you a very important question. You will answer it truthfully, won't you?" "I'll try," promised Anne. "Do you think I'm wrong in my upper story?" asked Paul, as if his very existence depended on her reply. "Goodness, no, Paul," exclaimed Anne in amazement. "Certainly you're not. What put such an idea into your head?" "Mary Jo, but she didn't know I heard her. Mrs. Peter Sloane's hired girl, Veronica, came to see Mary Jo last evening, and I heard them talking in the kitchen as I was going through the hall. I heard Mary Jo say, 'Dat Paul, he is the queerest little boy. He talks dat queer. I think there's something wrong in his upper story.' I couldn't sleep last night for ever so long, thinking of it and wondering if Mary Jo was right. I couldn't bear to ask Grandma about it somehow, but I made up my mind I'd ask you. I'm so glad you think I'm all right in my upper story." "Of course you are. Mary Jo is a silly, ignorant girl, and you are never to worry about anything she says," said Anne indignantly, secretly resolving to give Mrs. Irving a discreet hint as to the advisability of restraining Mary Jo's tongue. "Well, that's a weight off my mind," said Paul. "I'm perfectly happy now, teacher, thanks to you. It wouldn't be nice to have something wrong in your upper story, would it, teacher?" I suppose the reason Mary Jo imagines I have is because I tell her what I think about things sometimes. It is a rather dangerous practice, admitted Anne, out of the depths of her own experience. Well, by and by I'll tell you the thoughts I told Mary Jo, and you can see for yourself if there's anything queer in them, said Paul. But I'll wait till it begins to get dark. That is the time I ache to tell people things, and when nobody else is handy, I just have to tell Mary Jo. But after this I won't, if it makes her imagine I'm wrong in my upper story. I'll just ache and bear it. And if the ache gets too bad, you can come up to Green Gables and tell me your thoughts, suggested Anne, with all the gravity that endeared her to children who so dearly love to be taken seriously. Yes, I will. But I hope Davy won't be there when I go, because he makes faces at me. I don't mind very much, because he is such a little boy and I am quite a big one. But still, it is not pleasant to have faces made at you. And Davy makes such terrible ones. Sometimes I am frightened he will never get his face straightened out again. He makes them at me in church when I ought to be thinking of sacred things. Dora likes me, though, and I like her, but not so well as I did before she told Minnie May Barry that she meant to marry me when I grew up. I may marry somebody when I grow up, but I'm far too young to be thinking of it yet. Don't you think, teacher? Rather young, agreed teacher. Speaking of marrying, reminds me of another thing that has been troubling me of late, continued Paul. Mrs. Lynde was down here one day last week having tea with Grandma, and Grandma made me show her my little mother's picture, the one Father sent me for my birthday present. I didn't exactly want to show it to Mrs. Lynde. Mrs. Lynde is a good, kind woman, but she isn't the sort of person you want to show your mother's picture to. You know, teacher. But of course I obeyed Grandma. Mrs. Lynde said she was very pretty, but kind of actressy looking, and must have been an awful lot younger than Father. Then she said, "Some of these days your Pa will be marrying again, likely. How will you like to have a new ma, Master Paul?" Well, the idea almost took my breath away, teacher, but I wasn't going to let Mrs. Lynde see that. I just looked her straight in the face, like this, and I said, "Mrs. Lynde, Father made a pretty good job of picking out my first mother, and I could trust him to pick out just as good a one the second time." And I can trust him, teacher, but still, I hope, if he ever does give me a new mother, he'll ask my opinion about her before it's too late. There's Mary Jo coming to call us to tea. I'll go and consult with her about the shortbread. As a result of the consultation, Mary Jo cut the shortbread and added a dish of preserves to the bill of fare. Anne poured the tea, and she and Paul had a very merry meal in the dim old sitting room, whose windows were open to the Gulf breezes, and they talked so much nonsense that Mary Jo was quite scandalised and told Veronica the next evening that the school miss was as queer as Paul. After tea, Paul took Anne up to his room to show her his mother's picture, which had been the mysterious birthday present kept by Mrs. Irving in the bookcase. Paul's little low-ceilinged room was a soft whirl of ruddy light from the sun that was setting over the sea and swinging shadows from the fir trees that grew close to the square, deep-set window. From out this soft glow and glamour shone a sweet, girlish face with tender mother eyes that was hanging on the wall at the foot of the bed. "That's my little mother," said Paul with loving pride. "I got Grandma to hang it there where I'd see it as soon as I opened my eyes in the morning. I never mind not having the light when I go to bed now, because it just seems as if my little mother was right here with me. Father knew just what I would like for a birthday present, although he never asked me. Isn't it wonderful how much fathers do know?" "Your mother was very lovely, Paul, and you look a little like her, but her eyes and hair are darker than yours." "My eyes are the same colour as Father's," said Paul, flying about the room to heap all available cushions on the window seat. But Father's hair is grey. He has lots of it, but it is grey. You see, Father is nearly 50. That's a ripe old age, isn't it? But it's only outside he's old. Inside he's just as young as anybody. Now, teacher, please sit here, and I'll sit at your feet. May I lay my head against your knee? That's the way my little mother and I used to sit. Oh, this is real splendid, I think. Now, I want to hear those thoughts which Mary Jo pronounces so queer, said Anne, patting the mop of curls at her side. Paul never needed any coaxing to tell his thoughts, at least to congenial souls. I thought them out in the fir grove one night, he said dreamily. Of course, I didn't believe them, but I thought them. You know, teacher, and then I wanted to tell them to somebody, and there was nobody but Mary Jo. Mary Jo was in the pantry setting bread, and I sat down on the bench beside her, and I said, Mary Jo, do you know what I think? I think the evening star is a lighthouse on the land where the fairies dwell. And Mary Jo said, Well, yous are the queer one. There ain't no such thing as fairies. I was very much provoked. Of course, I knew there are no fairies, but that needn't prevent my thinking there is. You know, teacher. But I tried again quite patiently. I said, Well then, Mary Jo, do you know what I think? I think an angel walks over the world after the sun sets. A great, tall, white angel with silvery folded wings, and sings the flowers and birds to sleep. Children can hear him if they know how to listen. Then Mary Jo held up her hands all over flour and said, Well, yous are the queer little boy. Yous making me feel scare. And she really did look scared. I went out then and whispered the rest of my thoughts to the garden. There was a little birch tree in the garden, and it died. Grandma says the salt spray killed it, but I think the dryad belonging to it was a foolish dryad who wandered away to see the world and got lost. And the little tree was so lonely it died of a broken heart. And when the poor foolish little dryad gets tired of the world and comes back to her tree, her heart will break, said Anne. Yes, but if dryads are foolish, they must take the consequences just as if they were real people, said Paul gravely. Do you know what I think about the new moon, teacher? I think it is a little golden boat full of dreams. And when it tips on a cloud, some of them spill out and fall into your sleep. Exactly, teacher. Oh, you do know. And I think the violets are little snips of the sky that fell down when the angels cut out holes for the stars to shine through. And the buttercups are made out of old sunshine, and I think the sweet peas will be butterflies when they go to heaven. Now, teacher, do you see anything so very queer about those thoughts? No, laddie dear, they are not queer at all. They are strange and beautiful thoughts for a little boy to think, and so people who couldn't think anything of the sort themselves, if they tried for 100 years, think them queer. But keep on thinking them, Paul. Some day you are going to be a poet, I believe. When Anne reached home, she found a very different type of boyhood waiting to be put to bed. Davy was sulky, and when Anne had undressed him, he bounced into bed and buried his face in the pillow. Davy, you have forgotten to say your prayers, said Anne rebukingly. No, I didn't forget, said Davy defiantly. But I ain't going to say my prayers any more. I'm going to give up trying to be good, because no matter how good I am, you'd like Paul Irving better. So I might as well be bad and have the fun of it. I don't like Paul Irving better, said Anne seriously. I like you just as well, only in a different way. But I want you to like me in the same way, pouted Davy. You can't like people in the same way. You don't like Dora and me the same way, do you? Davy sat up and reflected. No, he admitted at last. I like Dora because she's my sister, but I like you because you're you. And I like Paul because he is Paul, and Davy because he is Davy, said Anne gaily. Well, I kind of wish I'd said my prayers then, said Davy, convinced by this logic. But it's too much bother getting out now to say them. I'll say them twice over in the morning, Anne. Won't that do as well? No, Anne was positive it would not do as well. So Davy scrambled out and knelt down at her knee. When he had finished his devotions, he leaned back on his little bare brown heels and looked up at her. Anne, I'm gooder than I used to be. Yes, indeed you are, Davy, said Anne, who never hesitated to give credit where credit was due. I know I'm gooder, said Davy confidently, and I'll tell you how I know it. Today Marilla gave me 2 pieces of bread and jam, one for me and one for Dora. One was a good deal bigger than the other, and Marilla didn't say which was mine. But I gave the biggest piece to Dora. That was good of me, wasn't it? Very good, and very manly, Davy. Of course, admitted Davy. Dora wasn't very hungry, and she only ate half her slice, and then she gave the rest to me. But I didn't know she was going to do that when I give it to her, so I was good, Anne. In the twilight, Anne sauntered down to the Dryad's Bubble and saw Gilbert Blythe coming down through the dusky haunted wood. She had a sudden realization that Gilbert was a schoolboy no longer, and how manly he looked. The tall, frank-faced fellow with the clear, straightforward eyes and the broad shoulders. Anne thought Gilbert was a very handsome lad, even though he didn't look at all like her ideal man. She and Diana had long ago decided what kind of man they admired, and their tastes seemed exactly similar. He must be very tall and distinguished-looking, with melancholy, inscrutable eyes, and a melting, sympathetic voice. There was nothing either melancholy or inscrutable in Gilbert's physiognomy. But of course that didn't matter in friendship. Gilbert stretched himself out on the ferns beside the bubble and looked approvingly at Anne. If Gilbert had been asked to describe his ideal woman, the description would have answered point for point to Anne, even to those 7 tiny freckles whose obnoxious presence still continued to vex her soul. Gilbert was as yet little more than a boy, but a boy has his dreams, as have others, and in Gilbert's future there was always a girl with big, limpid grey eyes and a face as fine and delicate as a flower. He had made up his mind also that his future must be worthy of its goddess. Even in quiet Avonlea there were temptations to be met and faced. White Sands youth were a rather fast set, and Gilbert was popular wherever he went. But he meant to keep himself worthy of Anne's friendship, and perhaps some distant day her love, and he watched over word and thought and deed as jealously as if her clear eyes were to pass in judgment on it. She held over him the unconscious influence that every girl, whose ideals are high and pure, wields over her friends, an influence which would endure as long as she was faithful to those ideals, and which she would as certainly lose if she were ever false to them. In Gilbert's eyes, Anne's greatest charm was the fact that she never stooped to the petty practices of so many of the Avonlea girls. The small jealousies, the little deceits and rivalries, the palpable bids for favour. Anne held herself apart from all this, not consciously or of design, but simply because anything of the sort was utterly foreign to her transparent, impulsive nature, crystal clear in its motives and aspirations. But Gilbert did not attempt to put his thoughts into words, for he had already too good reason to know that Anne would mercilessly and frostily nip all attempts at sentiment in the bud, or laugh at him, which was 10 times worse. "You look like a real dryad under that birch tree," he said teasingly. "I love birch trees," said Anne, laying her cheek against the creamy satin of the slim bole. with one of the pretty, caressing gestures that came so natural to her. "Then you'll be glad to hear that Mr. Major Spencer has decided to set out a row of white birches all along the road front of his farm, by way of encouraging the avis," said Gilbert. "He was talking to me about it today. Major Spencer is the most progressive and public-spirited man in Avonlea, and Mr. William Bell is going to set out a spruce hedge along his road front and up his lane. Our society is getting on splendidly, Anne. It is past the experimental stage, and it is an accepted fact. The older folks are beginning to take an interest in it, and the White Sands people are talking of starting one too. Even Alicia Wright has come round since that day the Americans from the hotel had the picnic at the shore. They praised our roadsides so highly and said they were so much prettier than in any other part of the island. And when, in due time, the other farmers follow Mr. Spencer's good example and plant ornamental trees and hedges along their road fronts, Avonlea will be the prettiest settlement in the province." "The aides are talking of taking up the graveyard," said Anne, "and I hope they will, because there will have to be a subscription for that, and it would be no use for the society to try it after the Hall affair. But the aides would never have stirred in the matter if the society hadn't put it into their thoughts unofficially. Those trees we planted on the church grounds are flourishing, and the trustees have promised me that they will fence in the school grounds next year. If they do, I'll have an arbour day, and every scholar shall plant a tree, and we'll have a garden in the corner by the road." "We've succeeded in almost all our plans so far, except in getting the old Bolter house removed," said Gilbert, "and I've given that up in despair. Levi won't have it taken down just to vex us. There's a contrary streak in all the Bolters, and it's strongly developed in him. Julia Bell wants to send another committee to him, but I think the better way will just be to leave him severely alone," said Anne sagely. "And trust to Providence, as Mrs. Lynde says," smiled Gilbert. "Certainly, no more committees. They only aggravate him. Julia Bell thinks you can do anything, if you only have a committee to attempt it. Next spring, Anne, we must start an agitation for nice lawns and grounds. We'll sow good seed betimes this winter. I've a treatise here on lawns and lawn making, and I'm going to prepare a paper on the subject soon. Well, I suppose our vacation is almost over. School opens Monday." "Has Ruby Gillis got the comedy school?" "Yes. Priscilla wrote that she had taken her own home school, so the comedy trustees gave it to Ruby. I'm sorry Priscilla is not coming back, but since she can't, I'm glad Ruby has got the school. She will be home for Saturdays, and it will seem like old times, to have her and Jane and Diana and myself all together again." Marilla, just home from Mrs. Lynde's, was sitting on the back porch step when Anne returned to the house. "Rachel and I have decided to have our cruise to town tomorrow," she said. "Mr. Lynde is feeling better this week, and Rachel wants to go before he has another sick spell." "I intend to get up extra early tomorrow morning, for I've ever so much to do," said Anne virtuously. "For one thing, I'm going to shift the feathers from my old bed tick to the new one. I ought to have done it long ago, but I've just kept putting it off. It's such a detestable task. It's a very bad habit to put off disagreeable things, and I never mean to again, or else I can't comfortably tell my pupils not to do it. That would be inconsistent. Then I want to make a cake for Mr. Harrison, and finish my paper on gardens for the Avis, and write Stella, and wash and start my muslin dress, and make Dora's new apron." "You won't get half done," said Marilla pessimistically. "I never yet planned to do a lot of things, but something happened to prevent me." Chapter 20. The Way It Often Happens. Anne rose betimes the next morning and blithely greeted the fresh day, when the banners of the sunrise were shaken triumphantly across the pearly skies. Green Gables lay in a pool of sunshine, flecked with the dancing shadows of poplar and willow. Beyond the land was Mr. Harrison's wheat field, a great wind-rippled expanse of pale gold. The world was so beautiful that Anne spent 10 blissful minutes hanging idly over the garden gate, drinking the loveliness in. After breakfast, Marilla made ready for her journey. Dora was to go with her, having been long promised this treat. "Now, Davy, you try to be a good boy and don't bother Anne," she straightly charged him. "If you are good, I'll bring you a striped candy cane from town." For alas, Marilla had stooped to the evil habit of bribing people to be good. "I won't be bad on purpose, but supposin' I'm bad s'accidentally?" Davy wanted to know. "You'll have to guard against accidents," admonished Marilla. "Anne, if Mr. Shearer comes today, get a nice roast and some steak. If he doesn't, you'll have to kill a fowl for dinner tomorrow." Anne nodded. "I'm not going to bother cooking any dinner for just Davy and myself today," she said. "That cold ham bone will do for noon lunch, and I'll have some steak fried for you when you come home at night." "I'm going to help Mr. Harrison haul dulse this morning," announced Davy. "He asked me to, and I'll guess he'll ask me to dinner too. Mr. Harrison is an awful kind man. He's a real sociable man. I hope I'll be like him when I grow up. I mean, behave like him. I don't want to look like him. But I guess there's no danger, for Mrs. Lynde says I'm a very handsome child. Do you suppose it'll last, Anne? I want to know." "I dare say it will," said Anne gravely. "You are a handsome boy, Davy." Marilla looked volumes of disapproval. "But you must live up to it and be just as nice and gentlemanly as you look to be." "And you told Minnie May Barry the other day, when you found her crying 'cause someone said she was ugly, that if she was nice and kind and loving, people wouldn't mind her looks," said Davy discontentedly. "Seems to me you can't get out of being good in this world for some reason or another. You just have to behave." "Don't you want to be good?" asked Marilla, who had learned a great deal, but had not yet learned the futility of asking such questions. "Yes, I want to be good, but not too good," said Davy cautiously. "You don't have to be very good to be a Sunday school superintendent. Mr. Bell's that, and he's a real bad man." "Indeed he's not," said Marilla indignantly. "He is. He says he is himself," asseverated Davy. "He said it when he prayed in Sunday school last Sunday. He said he was a vile worm and a miserable sinner and guilty of the blackest iniquity." "What did he do that was so bad, Marilla? Did he kill anybody? Or steal the collection cents? I want to know." Fortunately, Mrs. Lynde came driving up the lane at this moment, and Marilla made off, feeling that she had escaped from the snare of the fowler, and wishing devoutly that Mr. Bell was not quite so highly figurative in his public petitions, especially in the hearing of small boys who were always wanting to know. Anne, left alone in her glory, worked with a will. The floor was swept, the beds made, the hens fed, the muslin dress washed and hung out on the line. Then Anne prepared for the transfer of feathers. She mounted to the garret and donned the first old dress that came to hand, a navy blue cashmere she had worn at 14. It was decidedly on the short side, and as skimpy as the notable wincey Anne had worn upon the occasion of her debut at Green Gables. But at least it would not be materially injured by down and feathers. Anne completed her toilet by tying a big red and white spotted handkerchief that had belonged to Matthew over her head, and thus accoutred, betook herself to the kitchen chamber, whither Marilla, before her departure, had helped her carry the feather bed. A cracked mirror hung by the chamber window, and in an unlucky moment Anne looked into it. There were those 7 freckles on her nose, more rampant than ever, or so it seemed in the glare of light from the unshaded window. "Oh, I forgot to rub that lotion on last night," she thought. "I'd better run down to the pantry and do it now." Anne had already suffered many things trying to remove those freckles. On one occasion, the entire skin had peeled off her nose, but the freckles remained. A few days previously, she had found a recipe for a freckle lotion in a magazine, and as the ingredients were within her reach, she straightway compounded it, much to the disgust of Marilla, who thought that if Providence had placed freckles on your nose, it was your bounden duty to leave them there. Anne scurried down to the pantry, which, always dim from the big willow growing close to the window, was now almost dark by reason of the shade drawn to exclude flies. Anne caught the bottle containing the lotion from the shelf and copiously anointed her nose therewith by means of a little sponge sacred to the purpose. This important duty done, she returned to her work. Anyone who has ever shifted feathers from one tick to another will not need to be told that when Anne finished, she was a sight to behold. Her dress was white with down and fluff, and her front hair, escaping from under the handkerchief, was adorned with a veritable halo of feathers. At this auspicious moment, a knock sounded at the kitchen door. "That must be Mr. Shearer," thought Anne. "I'm in a dreadful mess, but I'll have to run down as I am, for he's always in a hurry." Down flew Anne to the kitchen door. If ever a charitable floor did open to swallow up a miserable, befeathered damsel, the Green Gables porch floor should promptly have engulfed Anne at that moment. On the doorstep was standing Priscilla Grant, golden and fair in silk attire. A short, stout, grey-haired lady in a tweed suit, and another lady, tall, stately, wonderfully gowned, with a beautiful high-bred face and large, black-lashed violet eyes, whom Anne instinctively felt, as she would have said in her earlier days, to be Mrs. Charlotte E. Morgan. In the dismay of the moment, one thought stood out from the confusion of Anne's mind, and she grasped at it as at the proverbial straw. All Mrs. Morgan's heroines were noted for rising to the occasion. No matter what their troubles were, they invariably rose to the occasion and showed their superiority over all ills of time, space, and quantity. Anne therefore felt it was her duty to rise to the occasion, and she did it, so perfectly that Priscilla afterward declared she never admired Anne Shirley more than at that moment. No matter what her outraged feelings were, she did not show them. She greeted Priscilla and was introduced to her companions as calmly and composedly as if she had been arrayed in purple and fine linen. To be sure, it was somewhat of a shock to find that the lady she had instinctively felt to be Mrs. Morgan was not Mrs. Morgan at all, but an unknown Mrs. Pendexter, while the stout little grey-haired woman was Mrs. Morgan. But in the greater shock, the lesser lost its power. Anne ushered her guests to the spare room and thence into the parlour, where she left them while she hastened out to help Priscilla unharness her horse. "It's dreadful to come upon you so unexpectedly as this," apologised Priscilla, "but I did not know till last night that we were coming. Aunt Charlotte is going away Monday, and she had promised to spend today with a friend in town. But last night her friend telephoned to her not to come because they were quarantined for scarlet fever. So I suggested we come here instead, for I knew you were longing to see her. We called at the White Sands Hotel and brought Mrs. Pendexter with us. She is a friend of Aunt's and lives in New York, and her husband is a millionaire. We can't stay very long, for Mrs. Pendexter has to be back at the hotel by 5 o'clock. Several times, while they were putting away the horse, Anne caught Priscilla looking at her in a furtive, puzzled way. She needn't stare at me so, Anne thought a little resentfully. If she doesn't know what it is to change a feather bed, she might imagine it. When Priscilla had gone to the parlour, and before Anne could escape upstairs, Diana walked into the kitchen. Anne caught her astonished friend by the arm. Diana Barry, who do you suppose is in that parlour at this very moment? Mrs. Charlotte E. Morgan, and a New York millionaire's wife. And here I am like this, and not a thing in the house for dinner but a cold ham bone, Diana." By this time, Anne had become aware that Diana was staring at her in precisely the same bewildered fashion as Priscilla had done. It was really too much. "Oh, Diana, don't look at me so," she implored. "You, at least, must know that the neatest person in the world couldn't empty feathers from one tick into another and remain neat in the process." It isn't the feathers," hesitated Diana. It's your nose, Anne." "My nose? Oh, Diana, surely nothing has gone wrong with it." Anne rushed to the little looking-glass over the sink. One glance revealed the fatal truth. Her nose was a brilliant scarlet. Anne sat down on the sofa, her dauntless spirit subdued at last. "What is the matter with it?" asked Diana, curiosity overcoming delicacy. "I thought I was rubbing my freckle lotion on it, but I must have used that red dye Marilla has for marking the pattern on her rugs," was the despairing response. "What shall I do?" "Wash it off," said Diana practically. "Perhaps it won't wash off. First I dye my hair, then I dye my nose. Marilla cut my hair off when I dyed it, but that remedy would hardly be practical in this case. Well, this is another punishment for vanity, and I suppose I deserve it, though there's not much comfort in that. It is really almost enough to make one believe in ill luck, though Mrs. Lynde says there is no such thing, because everything is foreordained." Fortunately, the dye washed off easily, and Anne, somewhat consoled, betook herself to the east gable while Diana ran home. Presently Anne came down again, clothed and in her right mind. The muslin dress she had fondly hoped to wear was bobbing merrily about on the line outside, so she was forced to content herself with her black lawn. She had the fire on and the tea steeping when Diana returned. The latter wore her muslin, at least, and carried a covered platter in her hand. "Mother sent you this," she said, lifting the cover and displaying a nicely carved and jointed chicken to Anne's grateful eyes. The chicken was supplemented by light new bread, excellent butter and cheese, Marilla's fruitcake, and a dish of preserved plums, floating in their golden syrup as in congealed summer sunshine. There was a big bowlful of pink and white asters also, by way of decoration. Yet the spread seemed very meagre beside the elaborate one formerly prepared for Mrs. Morgan. Anne's hungry guests, however, did not seem to think anything was lacking, and they ate the simple viands with apparent enjoyment. But after the first few moments, Anne thought no more of what was or what was not on her bill of fare. Mrs. Morgan's appearance might be somewhat disappointing, as even her loyal worshippers had been forced to admit to each other, but she proved to be a delightful conversationalist. She had travelled extensively and was an excellent storyteller. She had seen much of men and women, and crystallized her experiences into witty little sentences and epigrams which made her hearers feel as if they were listening to one of the people in clever books. But under all her sparkle, there was a strongly felt undercurrent of true, womanly sympathy and kind-heartedness, which won affection as easily as her brilliancy won admiration. Nor did she monopolize the conversation. She could draw others out as skillfully and fully as she could talk herself, and Anne and Diana found themselves chattering freely to her. Mrs. Pendexter said little. She merely smiled with her lovely eyes and lips, and ate chicken and fruitcake and preserves with such exquisite grace that she conveyed the impression of dining on ambrosia and honeydew. But then, as Anne said to Diana later on, anybody so divinely beautiful as Mrs. Pendexter didn't need to talk. It was enough for her just to look. After dinner, they all had a walk through Lover's Lane and Violet Vale and the Birch Path. Then back through the haunted wood to the Dryad's Bubble, where they sat down and talked for a delightful last half hour. Mrs. Morgan wanted to know how the haunted wood came by its name, and laughed until she cried when she heard the story and Anne's dramatic account of a certain memorable walk through it at the witching hour of twilight. "It has indeed been a feast of reason and flow of soul, hasn't it?" said Anne, when her guests had gone and she and Diana were alone again. "I don't know which I enjoyed more, listening to Mrs. Morgan or gazing at Mrs. Pendexter. I believe we had a nicer time than if we'd known they were coming and been cumbered with much serving. You must stay to tea with me, Diana, and we'll talk it over. Priscilla says Mrs. Pendexter's husband's sister is married to an English earl. And yet she took second helping of the plum preserves," said Diana, as if the two facts were somehow incompatible. "I dare say even the English earl himself wouldn't have turned up his aristocratic nose at Marilla's plum preserves," said Anne proudly. Anne did not mention the misfortune which had befallen her nose. Anne did not mention the misfortune which had befallen her nose when she related the day's history to Marilla that evening, but she took the bottle of freckle lotion and emptied it out of the window. "I shall never try any beautifying messes again," she said, darkly resolute. "They may do for careful, deliberate people, but for anyone so hopelessly given over to making mistakes as I seem to be, it's tempting fate to meddle with them." Chapter 21. Sweet Miss Lavender. School opened, and Anne returned to her work, with fewer theories but considerably more experience. She had several new pupils, 6- and 7-year-olds just venturing, round-eyed, into a world of wonder. Among them were Davy and Dora. Davy sat with Milty Boulter, who had been going to school for a year, and was therefore quite a man of the world. Dora had made a compact at Sunday school the previous Sunday to sit with Lily Sloane. But Lily Sloane not coming the first day, she was temporarily assigned to Mirabel Cotton, who was 10 years old and therefore, in Dora's eyes, one of the big girls. "I think school is great fun," Davy told Marilla when he got home that night. "You'd said I'd find it hard to sit still, and I did. You mostly do tell the truth, I notice, but you can wriggle your legs about under the desk, and that helps a lot. It's splendid to have so many boys to play with. I sit with Milty Boulter, and he's fine. He's longer than me, but I'm wider. It's nicer to sit in the back seats, but you can't sit there till your legs grow long enough to touch the floor. Milty drawed a picture of Anne on his slate, and it was awful ugly, and I told him if he made pictures of Anne like that, I'd lick him at recess. I thought first I'd draw one of him and put horns and a tail on it, but I was afraid it would hurt his feelings, and Anne says you should never hurt anyone's feelings. It seems it's dreadful to have your feelings hurt. It's better to knock a boy down than hurt his feelings if you must do something. Milty said he wasn't scared of me, but he'd just as soon call it somebody else to oblige me. So he rubbed out Anne's name and printed Barbara Shaw's under it. Milty doesn't like Barbara because she calls him a sweet little boy, and once she patted him on his head. Dora said primly that she liked school, but she was very quiet, even for her. And when at twilight Marilla bade her to go upstairs to bed, she hesitated and began to cry. I'm frightened," she sobbed. I don't want to go upstairs alone in the dark." "What notion have you got into your head now?" demanded Marilla. "I'm sure you've gone to bed alone all summer and never been frightened before." Dora still continued to cry, so Anne picked her up, cuddled her sympathetically, and whispered, "Tell Anne all about it, sweetheart. What are you frightened of?" Of Mirabel Cotton's uncle," sobbed Dora. "Mirabel Cotton told me all about her family today in school. Nearly everybody in her family has died, all her grandfathers and grandmothers, and ever so many uncles and aunts. They have a habit of dying, Mirabel says. Mirabel's awful proud of having so many dead relations, and she told me what they all died of, and what they said, and how they looked in their coffins. And Mirabel says one of her uncles was seen walking around the house after he was buried. Her mother saw him. I don't mind the rest so much, but I can't help thinking about that uncle." Anne went upstairs with Dora and sat by her until she fell asleep. The next day, Mirabel Cotton was kept in at recess and gently but firmly given to understand that when you are so unfortunate as to possess an uncle who persisted in walking about houses after he had been decently interred, it was not in good taste to talk about that eccentric gentleman to your desk-mate of tender years. Mirabel thought this very harsh. The Cottons had not much to boast of. How was she to keep her prestige among her schoolmates if she were forbidden to make capital out of the family ghost? September slipped by into a gold and crimson graciousness of October. One Friday evening, Diana came over. "I'd a letter from Ella Kimball today, Anne, and she wants us to go over to tea tomorrow afternoon to meet her cousin, Irene Trent, from town. But we can't get one of our horses to go, for they'll all be in use tomorrow, and your pony is lame, so I suppose we can't go." "Why can't we walk?" suggested Anne. "If we go straight back through the woods, we'll strike the West Grafton Road, not far from the Kimball place. I was through that way last winter, and I know the road. It's no more than 4 miles, and we won't have to walk home, for Oliver Kimball will be sure to drive us. He'll be only too glad of the excuse, for he goes to see Carrie Sloane, and they say his father will hardly ever let him have a horse." It was accordingly arranged that they should walk, and the following afternoon they set out, going by way of Lover's Lane to the back of the Cuthbert farm, where they found a road leading into the heart of acres of glimmering beech and maple woods, which were all in a wondrous glow of flame and gold, lying in a great purple stillness and peace. "It's as if the year were kneeling to pray in a vast cathedral full of mellow-stained light, isn't it?" said Anne dreamily. "It doesn't seem right to hurry through it, does it? It seems irreverent, like running in a church." "We must hurry, though," said Diana, glancing at her watch. "We've left ourselves little enough time as it is." "Well, I'll walk fast, but don't ask me to talk," said Anne, quickening her pace. "I just want to drink the day's loveliness in. I feel as if she were holding it out to my lips like a cup of airy wine, and I'll take a sip at every step." Perhaps it was because she was so absorbed in drinking it in that Anne took the left turning when they came to a fork in the road. She should have taken the right, but ever afterward she counted it the most fortunate mistake of her life. They came out finally to a lonely, grassy road, with nothing in sight along it but ranks of spruce saplings. "Why, where are we?" exclaimed Diana in bewilderment. "This isn't the West Grafton Road." "No, it's the Base Line Road in Middle Grafton," said Anne rather shamefacedly. "I must have taken the wrong turning at the fork. I don't know where we are exactly, but we must be all of 3 miles from Kimball's still." "Then we can't get there by 5, for it's 4:30 now," said Diana, with a despairing look at her watch. "We'll arrive after they have had their tea, and they'll have all the bother of getting ours over again." "We'd better turn back and go home," suggested Anne humbly, but Diana, after consideration, vetoed this. "No, we may as well go and spend the evening, since we have come this far." A few yards further on, the girls came to a place where the road forked again. Which of these do we take? Asked Diana dubiously. Anne shook her head. I don't know, and we can't afford to make any more mistakes. Here is a gate and a lane leading right into the wood. There must be a house at the other side. Let us go down and inquire. What a romantic old lane this is, said Diana, as they walked along its twists and turns. It ran under patriarchal old firs, whose branches met above, creating a perpetual gloom in which nothing except moss could grow. On either hand were brown wood floors, crossed here and there by fallen lances of sunlight. All was very still and remote, as if the world and the cares of the world were far away. I feel as if we were walking through an enchanted forest, said Anne in a hushed tone. Do you suppose we'll ever find our way back to the real world again, Diana? We shall presently come to a palace with a spellbound princess in it, I think. Around the next turn they came in sight, not indeed of a palace, but of a little house almost as surprising as a palace would have been in this province of conventional wooden farmhouses, all as much alike in general characteristics as if they had grown from the same seed. Anne stopped short in rapture, and Diana exclaimed, Oh, I know where we are now. That is the little stone house where Miss Lavender Lewis lives. Echo Lodge, she calls it, I think. I've often heard of it, but I've never seen it before. Isn't it a romantic spot? It's the sweetest, prettiest place I ever saw or imagined, said Anne delightedly. It looks like a bit out of a storybook or a dream. The house was a low-eaved structure built of undressed blocks of red island sandstone, with a little peaked roof out of which peered 2 dormer windows, with quaint wooden hoods over them and 2 great chimneys. The whole house was covered with a luxuriant growth of ivy, finding easy foothold on the rough stonework and turned by autumn frosts to most beautiful bronze and wine-red tints. Before the house was an oblong garden into which the lane gate where the girls were standing opened. The house bounded it on one side. On the 3 others, it was enclosed by an old stone dyke, so overgrown with moss and grass and ferns that it looked like a high green bank. On the right and left, the tall dark spruces spread their palm-like branches over it. But below, it was a little meadow, green with clover aftermath, sloping down to the blue loop of the Grafton River. No other house or clearing was in sight. Nothing but hills and valleys covered with feathery young firs. I wonder what sort of person Miss Lewis is, speculated Diana as they opened the gate into the garden. They say she is very peculiar. She'll be interesting then, said Anne decidedly. Peculiar people are always that at least, whatever else they are or are not. Didn't I tell you we would come to an enchanted palace? I knew the elves hadn't woven magic over that lane for nothing. But Miss Lavender Lewis is hardly a spellbound princess, laughed Diana. She's an old maid. She's 45 and quite grey, I've heard. Oh, that's only part of the spell, asserted Anne confidently. At heart, she's young and beautiful still. And if we only knew how to unloose the spell, she would step forth radiant and fair again. But we don't know how. It's always and only the prince who knows that, and Miss Lavender's prince hasn't come yet. Perhaps some fatal mischance has befallen him, though that's against the law of all fairy tales. I'm afraid he came long ago and went away again, said Diana. They say she used to be engaged to Stephen Irving, Paul's father, when they were young, but they quarrelled and parted. Hush, warned Anne. The door is open. The girls paused in the porch under the tendrils of ivy and knocked at the open door. There was a patter of steps inside, and a rather odd little personage presented herself. A girl of about 14, with a freckled face, a snub nose, a mouth so wide that it really did seem as if it stretched from ear to ear, and 2 long braids of fair hair tied with 2 enormous bows of blue ribbon. "Is Miss Lewis at home?" asked Diana. "Yes, Ma'am. Come in, Ma'am. I'll tell Miss Lavender you're here, Ma'am. She's upstairs, Ma'am." With this, the small handmaiden whisked out of sight, and the girls, left alone, looked about them with delighted eyes. The interior of this wonderful little house was quite as interesting as its exterior. The room had a low ceiling and 2 square, small-paned windows, curtained with muslin frills. All the furnishings were old-fashioned, but so well and daintily kept that the effect was delicious. But it must be candidly admitted that the most attractive feature to 2 healthy girls who had just tramped 4 miles through autumn air was a table set out with pale blue china and laden with delicacies, while little golden-hued ferns scattered over the cloth gave it what Anne would have termed a festal air. "Miss Lavender must be expecting company to tea," she whispered. "There are 6 places set. But what a funny little girl she has. She looked like a messenger from Pixieland. I suppose she could have told us the road. But I was curious to see Miss Lavender. She's coming." And with that, Miss Lavender Lewis was standing in the doorway. The girls were so surprised that they forgot good manners and simply stared. They had unconsciously been expecting to see the usual type of elderly spinster as known to their experience, a rather angular personage with prim grey hair and spectacles. Nothing more unlike Miss Lavender could possibly be imagined. She was a little lady with snow-white hair, beautifully wavy and thick, and carefully arranged in becoming puffs and coils. Beneath it was an almost girlish face, pink-cheeked and sweet-lipped, with big soft brown eyes and dimples. Actually dimples. She wore a very dainty gown of cream muslin with pale-hued roses on it, a gown which would have seemed ridiculously juvenile on most women of her age, but which suited Miss Lavender so perfectly that you never thought about it at all. "Charlotte the Fourth says that you wish to see me," she said, in a voice that matched her appearance. "We wanted to ask the right road to West Grafton," said Diana. "We are invited to tea at Mr. Kimball's, but we took the wrong path coming through the woods and came out to the base line instead of the West Grafton Road. Do we take the right or left turning at your gate?" "The left," said Miss Lavender, with a hesitating glance at her tea-table. Then she exclaimed, as if in a sudden little burst of resolution, "But oh, won't you stay and have tea with me? Please do. Mr. Kimball's will have tea over before you get there, and Charlotte the Fourth and I will be so glad to have you." Diana looked mute inquiry at Anne. "We'd like to stay," said Anne promptly, for she had made up her mind that she wanted to know more of this surprising Miss Lavender. "If it won't inconvenience you. But you are expecting other guests, aren't you?" Miss Lavender looked at her tea-table again and blushed. "I know you'll think me dreadfully foolish," she said. "I am foolish, and I'm ashamed of it when I'm found out. But never unless I am found out. I'm not expecting anybody. I was just pretending I was. You see, I was so lonely. I love company. That is, the right kind of company. But so few people ever come here because it is so far out of the way. Charlotte the Fourth was lonely too, so I just pretended I was going to have a tea party. I cooked for it and decorated the table for it and set it with my mother's wedding china, and I dressed up for it." Diana secretly thought Miss Lavender quite as peculiar as report had pictured her. The idea of a woman of 45 playing at having a tea party just as if she were a little girl. But Anne of the shining eyes exclaimed joyfully, "Oh, do you imagine things too?" That, too, revealed a kindred spirit to Miss Lavender. "Yes, I do," she confessed boldly. "Of course, it's silly in anybody as old as I am. But what is the use of being an independent old maid if you can't be silly when you want to, and when it doesn't hurt anybody? A person must have some compensations. I don't believe I could live at times if I didn't pretend things. I'm not often caught at it, though, and Charlotta the Fourth never tells. But I'm glad to be caught today, for you have really come, and I have tea all ready for you. Will you go up to the spare room and take off your hats? It's the white door at the head of the stairs. I must run out to the kitchen and see that Charlotta the Fourth isn't letting the tea boil. Charlotta the Fourth is a very good girl, but she will let the tea boil." Miss Lavender tripped off to the kitchen on hospitable thoughts intent, and the girls found their way up to the spare room, an apartment as white as its door, lighted by the ivy-hung dormer window and looking, as Anne said, like the place where happy dreams grew. "This is quite an adventure, isn't it?" said Diana. "And isn't Miss Lavender sweet, if she is a little odd? She doesn't look a bit like an old maid." "She looks just as music sounds, I think," answered Anne. When they went down, Miss Lavender was carrying in the teapot, and behind her, looking vastly pleased, was Charlotta the Fourth, with a plate of hot biscuits. "Now, you must tell me your names," said Miss Lavender. "I'm so glad you are young girls. I love young girls. It's so easy to pretend I'm a girl myself when I'm with them. I do hate," with a little grimace, "to believe I'm old. Now, who are you, just for convenience sake?" "Diana Barry and Anne Shirley. May I pretend that I've known you for 100 years and call you Anne and Diana right away?" "You may," the girls said both together. "Then, just let's sit comfortably down and eat everything," said Miss Lavender happily. "Charlotta, you sit at the foot and help with the chicken. It is so fortunate that I made the sponge cake and doughnuts. Of course, it was foolish to do it for imaginary guests, I know. Charlotta the Fourth thought so, didn't you, Charlotta? But you see how well it has turned out. Of course, they wouldn't have been wasted, for Charlotta the Fourth and I could have eaten them through time. But sponge cake is not a thing that improves with time." That was a merry and memorable meal, and when it was over, they all went out to the garden, lying in the glamour of sunset. "I do think you have the loveliest place here," said Diana, looking round her admiringly. "Why do you call it Echo Lodge?" asked Anne. "Charlotta," said Miss Lavender. "Go into the house and bring out the little tin horn that is hanging over the clock shelf." Charlotta the Fourth skipped off and returned with the horn. "Blow it, Charlotta," commanded Miss Lavender. Charlotta accordingly blew, a rather raucous, strident blast. There was a moment's stillness, and then from the woods over the river came a multitude of fairy echoes, sweet, elusive, silvery, as if all the horns of Elfland were blowing against the sunset. Anne and Diana exclaimed in delight. "Now, laugh, Charlotta. Laugh loudly." Charlotta, who would probably have obeyed if Miss Lavender had told her to stand on her head, climbed upon the stone bench and laughed loud and heartily. Back came the echoes, as if a host of pixie people were mimicking her laughter in the purple woodlands and along the fir-fringed points. "People always admire my echoes very much," said Miss Lavender, as if the echoes were her personal property. "I love them myself. They are very good company, with a little pretending. On calm evenings, Charlotta the Fourth and I often sit out here and amuse ourselves with them. Charlotta, take back the horn and hang it carefully in its place." "Why do you call her Charlotta the Fourth?" asked Diana, who was bursting with curiosity on this point. "Just to keep her from getting mixed up with the other Charlottas in my thoughts," said Miss Lavender seriously. "They all look so much alike, there's no telling them apart. Her name isn't really Charlotta at all. It is, let me see, what is it? I think it's Leonora. Yes, it is Leonora. You see, it is this way. When Mother died 10 years ago, I couldn't stay here alone, and I couldn't afford to pay the wages of a grown-up girl. So I got little Charlotta Bowman to come and stay with me for board and clothes. Her name really was Charlotta. She was Charlotta the First. She was just 13. She stayed with me till she was 16, and then she went away to Boston because she could do better there. Her sister came to stay with me then. Her name was Julietta. Mrs. Bowman had a weakness for fancy names, I think, but she looked so like Charlotta that I kept calling her that all the time, and she didn't mind. So I just gave up trying to remember her right name. She was Charlotta the Second. And when she went away, Evelina came, and she was Charlotta the Third. Now I have Charlotta the Fourth. But when she is 16, she's 14 now, she will want to go to Boston too, and what I shall do then I really do not know. Charlotta the Fourth is the last of the Bowman girls, and the best. The other Charlottas always let me see that they thought it silly of me to pretend things, but Charlotta the Fourth never does, no matter what she really may think. I don't care what people think about me if they don't let me see it." "Well," said Diana, looking regretfully at the setting sun, "I suppose we must go if we want to get to Mr. Kimball's before dark. We've had a lovely time, Miss Lewis." "Won't you come again to see me?" pleaded Miss Lavender. Tall Anne